Let me be direct with you from the outset because what has unfolded in Riyadh over the past 6 weeks demands directness. Everyone is focused on the ceasefire negotiations in Geneva. Everyone is asking whether Iran will compromise, whether Israel will accept terms, whether Washington can broker a lasting peace. But while the world has been watching those negotiations, while diplomats have been shuttling between capitals, while analysts have been parsing communiques and parsing body language, something far more consequential has been happening in the Arabian Peninsula. And most people do not even realize it has occurred. I am looking at a joint statement issued on March 18, 2026, that has been circulating among regional diplomatic circles for the past 42 days. It was not front page news in the New York Times. It was not the lead story on CNN. Most Western media outlets gave it perhaps 90 seconds of coverage before moving on to the next headline. What this statement represents is not a minor diplomatic realignment, it is not a temporary tactical shift. What this statement represents is the most significant geopolitical reversal in the Middle East since the Camp David Accords of 1978, and it changes everything about how power operates in this region for the next 2 decades. In the next 19 minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly why Saudi Arabia has fundamentally abandoned its 40-year strategic alliance with the United States, why this shift makes the Abraham Accords irrelevant, and why this matters more to your daily life than anything coming out of the ceasefire talks. This is the analysis you will not get from mainstream sources. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively discussed in foreign ministries across 3 continents, and understanding it correctly will tell you more about the next decade of global politics than 1,000 hours of cable news. Let's start with geography and recent history because the context matters. Saudi Arabia has been America's anchor ally in the Middle East since 1945, when President Franklin Roosevelt met King Abdulaziz aboard the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal. That relationship was built on a simple exchange. Saudi Arabia would guarantee stable oil supplies to the United States and accept payment in dollars, strengthening the petrodollar system. In return, the United States would provide military protection, advanced weapon systems, and diplomatic cover for the Saudi monarchy. For 8 decades, that arrangement held. Through the oil shocks of the 1970s, through the Iranian Revolution, through 2 Gulf Wars, through the War on Terror, Saudi Arabia remained Washington's most reliable partner in the region. But something changed in the past 5 years. The United States began shifting its strategic focus toward containing China. American military planners started talking openly about pivoting away from the Middle East. The shale revolution reduced America's dependence on Saudi oil, and critically, the Biden administration and then the current administration began treating Saudi Arabia not as an indispensable ally, but as a problematic partner whose human rights record and regional policies had become inconvenient. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, watched all of this carefully, and he drew conclusions. According to multiple diplomatic sources who spoke to Reuters and the Financial Times, MBS as he is known, concluded by early 2025 that the United States could no longer be relied upon as Saudi Arabia's primary security guarantor. The Ukraine conflict had demonstrated that American security commitments were increasingly conditional. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan had shown that American staying power was limited. And most importantly, the economic center of gravity was shifting eastward toward Asia, where China and India represented the future growth markets for Saudi oil. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now, let's talk about what actually happened in March 2026. Announcement number 1, the Riyadh-Beijing Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement. And this one matters more than anything else happening in Middle Eastern diplomacy right now. On March 18, 2026, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Chinese President Xi Jinping signed what both governments described as a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement during Xi's 3-day state visit to Saudi Arabia. The official communique was 73 pages long. It covered energy cooperation, infrastructure development, technology transfer, and defense coordination, but buried in Section 7, Subsection 4. 2 was a commitment that changes the entire strategic calculus of the region. Saudi Arabia agreed to accept payment for oil exports to China in yuan rather than dollars, not for a small percentage, not as an experiment, for 100% of oil shipments to China, which currently represents 8 million barrels per day, roughly 23% of total Saudi oil production. According to analysis by Bloomberg Economics and confirmed by multiple energy sector analysts, this represents the single largest defection from the petrodollar system since its establishment in 1974. But it goes further. The agreement included provisions for China to establish a naval logistics facility at Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia's largest oil export terminal on the Persian Gulf. This facility, which the South China Morning Post reports will be operational by January 2027, will be staffed by Chinese naval personnel and will include maintenance capabilities for Chinese warships. Think carefully about what this represents. Saudi Arabia, America's supposed anchor ally, is now hosting Chinese military forces on its territory. Chinese forces that can monitor and potentially protect the Strait of Hormuz. Chinese forces positioned less than 150 miles from the United States Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Commander Brian Shoneman, a retired U.S. Navy captain who served 3 tours in the Persian Gulf, described the Saudi decision as, and I am quoting him directly here, a strategic earthquake that fundamentally alters the balance of power in the Gulf and eliminates America's uncontested military dominance in the region. That is not analysis from an academic. That is assessment from someone who commanded vessels in those waters. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the Saudi normalization framework with Iran. This is the part that most Western analysts have either missed completely or dismissed as inconsequential. On April 2, 2026, just 15 days after the China agreement, Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan traveled to Tehran for direct talks with his Iranian counterpart, Hossein Amir Abdullahian. This was not a back-channel negotiation. This was not mediated by Oman or Iraq, as previous Saudi-Iran contacts have been. This was a direct public meeting in Tehran, broadcast on Iranian state television, with Prince Faisal standing beside Iranian officials in front of the flags of both nations. The joint statement that emerged from those talks committed both countries to, and I am reading from the text, full restoration of diplomatic relations, establishment of resident ambassadors, cooperation on regional security matters, and coordination on energy policy within OPEC Plus frameworks. That final point is critical. Coordination on energy policy means Saudi Arabia and Iran, which together control nearly 40% of OPEC production capacity, will be aligning their production decisions. They will be moving together on pricing. They will be acting as a bloc, according to reporting by the Wall Street Journal, citing 3 unnamed sources within the Saudi Energy Ministry. Riyadh and Tehran have already begun preliminary discussions about coordinated production cuts designed to drive oil prices above $95 per barrel by the fourth quarter of 2026. That price target is not arbitrary. At $95 per barrel, both countries achieve their fiscal break-even points and can fund expanded social programs and military modernization. At $95 per barrel, American shale producers face serious profitability pressures. At $95 per barrel, inflation accelerates in the United States and Europe, creating political pressure on Western governments. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the implications for American foreign policy become impossible to ignore. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly: the Saudi decision to suspend normalization talks with Israel. On April 10, 2026, the Saudi government issued a brief statement announcing that all discussions regarding potential normalization of relations with Israel were being indefinitely postponed due to, and I quote, Israel's continued military operations in Gaza and the failure of international efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace for the Palestinian people. The statement was issued late on a Friday afternoon Washington time. It received minimal coverage in American media. Most outlets that covered it at all treated it as a minor diplomatic setback, a temporary pause that could be reversed once the current crisis in Gaza subsided. But that interpretation misses what is actually happening. Saudi Arabia is not pausing normalization. Saudi Arabia is abandoning it. And the reason is not primarily about Gaza or Palestinian rights, though those considerations are real. The reason is strategic calculation. MBS has concluded that aligning with Israel and the United States against Iran is a losing strategy in a region where China is the ascendant power and where Iran has demonstrated that it cannot be defeated militarily or isolated economically. According to a detailed analysis published by the International Crisis Group on April 15th, Saudi intelligence assessments now conclude that Israel's military campaign in Gaza has permanently damaged Israel's standing in the Arab world, that normalization with Israel would provoke domestic unrest within Saudi Arabia that the monarchy cannot afford, and most critically, that Israel is becoming a strategic liability rather than an asset as the region's power dynamics shift toward accommodation with Iran and coordination with China. Think about the timeline. China brokers the Saudi-Iran rapprochement in March 2023. That deal holds and deepens over 3 years. China expands its role as regional mediator. Saudi Arabia signs comprehensive strategic partnership with China in March 2026. 15 days later, Saudi Arabia normalizes with Iran. 10 days after that, Saudi Arabia suspends Israel normalization. This is not a series of unconnected events. This is a coordinated strategic pivot executed over 3 years, with China playing the role of facilitator and guarantor. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The story you are hearing is about ceasefire negotiations, about humanitarian aid, about whether this or that faction will agree to lay down arms. That story is real, but it is not the story that matters for the next decade. The story that matters is the collapse of American influence in the Middle East and the emergence of a Chinese-mediated regional order that excludes Washington. The United States has spent trillions of dollars over the past 40 years maintaining military dominance in the Middle East. It has fought multiple wars. It has maintained massive permanent military bases in Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. It has provided hundreds of billions of dollars in military aid to Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states. The entire architecture of American grand strategy since 1979 has been built on the assumption that the Middle East must remain under American security leadership because of its oil reserves and strategic location, but that architecture is collapsing. Saudi Arabia, the keystone of the entire system, has decided that China offers a better security guarantee than the United States. Not because China has more military power in the region, it does not, but because China does not lecture Saudi Arabia about human rights, does not threaten to withhold weapons sales over policy disagreements, and most importantly, represents the future market for Saudi oil as Asian demand grows while Western demand stagnates. The Abraham Accords, which the Trump administration celebrated as historic, are now effectively dead. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized with Israel in 2020 because they believed it would strengthen their alliance with the United States against Iran. But if Saudi Arabia, the largest and most influential Gulf state, is now normalizing with Iran instead of Israel, the entire logic of the Abraham Accords collapses. Why would UAE and Bahrain maintain normalization with Israel if doing so isolates them from Saudi Arabia and the broader regional consensus? Secretary of State Marco Rubio traveled to Riyadh on April 23rd for emergency consultations with Saudi leadership. According to 3 sources familiar with the meetings who spoke to Politico, those talks were described as tense and unproductive. Rubio reportedly pressed the Saudis to reconsider the China agreement and to resume normalization talks with Israel. The Saudi response, according to these sources, was polite but firm. The kingdom's strategic decisions were final. The United States was welcome to continue military cooperation, but Saudi Arabia would no longer align its regional policy with American preferences. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States conducts high-level diplomacy with its supposed closest ally in the region, and that ally politely declines to adjust its policies, and American officials leave empty-handed, that is not ambiguity. That is not diplomatic nuance. That is a verdict. The verdict is that American leverage in the Middle East has eroded to the point where even close allies no longer feel compelled to accommodate American demands. If you are an American consumer, what is happening in Riyadh is not just a foreign policy story. It is a gas price story. If Saudi Arabia and Iran coordinate production cuts and drive oil to $95 per barrel, you will see that in every transaction you make. Gasoline prices rise, heating costs increase, freight costs embedded in every product you purchase go up. If you are a business owner with logistics operations, this is a fundamental cost structure shift. If you are an investor, this is a signal that the assumptions underlying American Middle East policy for 4 decades no longer hold. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Let me give you the clearest parallel. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE. Athens and Sparta, the 2 dominant powers in the Greek world, went to war. The conflict lasted 27 years. Both sides were exhausted, financially ruined, militarily weakened, and who emerged as the dominant power in the Greek world after Athens and Sparta destroyed each other? Macedon. Philip II of Macedon and later his son Alexander built an empire while the previous great powers were bleeding themselves in endless conflict. The parallel is exact. The United States is Athens, the established hegemon. Iran could be seen as Sparta, the challenger. They have been engaged in confrontation since 1979. 47 years of sanctions, proxy wars, military buildups, and mutual exhaustion. Neither side has won. Both sides have spent enormous resources. And who is rising while America and Iran have been locked in this struggle? China. China is building trade relationships. China is mediating conflicts. China is establishing the infrastructure of regional order. China is Macedon. The United States and Iran may eventually reach some accommodation, or they may continue their confrontation for another generation. It does not matter. The regional order is already changing around them. Saudi Arabia has looked at the chessboard and concluded that China holds better cards for the next 50 years than the United States does. That calculation may be right or wrong, but it is the calculation that MBS has made, and it is being acted upon right now. So where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, the United States accepts diminished influence in the Middle East and focuses its strategic resources on the Indo-Pacific competition with China. This path involves maintaining some military presence in the Gulf, but accepting that countries like Saudi Arabia will increasingly make independent strategic choices. It means acknowledging that the era of American dominance in the Middle East that began in 1979 is over. This is the path of managed decline, strategic retrenchment, and acceptance of a multipolar regional order. It is probably the most rational path. It is also the path that requires admitting failure, which makes it politically toxic in Washington. Path 2, the United States attempts to reassert influence through increased military presence, economic pressure on Saudi Arabia, and deeper security commitments to Israel and remaining allies. This path involves threatening Saudi Arabia with consequences for the China agreement, potentially including restrictions on arms sales or technology transfers. It means doubling down on the alliance with Israel, even as that alliance becomes more costly diplomatically. This path leads to greater confrontation, higher costs, and likely further alienation of regional partners. It is the path of doubled down commitment to a failing strategy. Path 3, the United States attempts to broker its own accommodation with Iran, undercutting China's role as mediator and creating a new regional security architecture that includes both traditional allies and former adversaries. This would require accepting Iranian influence in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon as permanent facts. It would require acknowledging Iran's nuclear program in some form. It would require offering sanctions relief and economic normalization. This path is strategically coherent but politically impossible in current American politics. No administration could survive the domestic backlash from appearing to appease Iran. I think we are closer to path 2 than the headlines suggest. The initial American response to Saudi Arabia's pivot has been denial and pressure, not acceptance or creative diplomacy. The Rubio trip to Riyadh was an attempt to reverse the Saudi decision through traditional leverage. It failed. The next step will likely be escalation, threats, and attempts to demonstrate that defying Washington carries costs. That approach will fail as well because Saudi Arabia has already secured an alternative security partner in China, which means American threats lack credibility, but I could be wrong. The smarter move would be path 1, accepting reduced influence and reallocating resources. We will know which path we are on within 6 months based on 3 indicators. First, watch whether the United States announces any drawdown of forces from Gulf bases. If force reductions begin, that signals path 1. Second, watch whether new arms sales to Saudi Arabia are approved or blocked. If sales are blocked, that signals path 2 escalation. Third, watch whether any senior American official travels to Tehran for direct talks. If that happens, it signals path 3 accommodation. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, if the petrodollar system fragments as more countries follow Saudi Arabia's example and accept payment in yuan or other currencies, what happens to the dollar's status as global reserve currency? Second, if American military bases in the Gulf become politically untenable as regional governments align with China, where does the United States project power from? Third, if the Middle East becomes a Chinese sphere of influence, does the United States have any strategy for competing in that environment beyond military posturing? Tell me in the comments what you think the United States does next. Tell me if you think this is a temporary setback or a permanent shift. Tell me whether you believe American foreign policy has the flexibility to adapt to this new reality. We will keep tracking every development in Riyadh, Beijing, Tehran, and Washington. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the Middle East beyond the headlines. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.